What needs to be understood is that each one of these species has an electromagnetic, geometrical field that extends around the entire Earth. Every one of them, and they're unique. Each one is completely unique. If there were only 2 insects on Earth, and that's the only 2 insects there were on the whole planet, they could not exist unless there was a consciousness grid around the planet that surrounded the planet just for them. And the geometry of it would reflect exactly the geometry of their body. You could tell very quickly that those bugs came from that particular geometry. So out of these 15 million life forms that are left on Earth today, there are 3 that are human. So we actually have 3 different kinds of human beings on Earth. They perceive the one reality in a different way. And the first one is the Aboriginals, the original people on Earth. So the Aboriginals in Australia, and there are little pockets of them around the world that are still functioning on the original grid that came out of humanity a long, long time ago. And then there is the next grid, which is much more, we really don't know very much about this grid geometrically, what it looks like or form. There's been almost no scientific research done on that at all. But on our level, this grid is believed to be a rhombic triacondohedron, which is a relationship between an icosahedron and a dodecahedron, but a very specific angle of how they are connected together. And it was the United States, we believe, who first scientifically discovered that this thing was actually around the world, though Russia had a lot to do with it. And we believe, we're not exactly sure because so much of this is kept secret. And what we do know is that this grid that goes around the world, it has places where the lines cross, and it's very interesting, very, very interesting, that most of the military bases in the world between Russia and the United States are located exactly on those nodal points. Why would they do that? Because they knew that that was the consciousness grid of the entire planet, and if they could control that grid, they can control all the people in the world. And so it's an obvious military move to make, and they've known this for a very long time now. I think it went back into probably the 60s when they first discovered this. There's also now a third grid. This is the grid that Chikuted, Arlich, Vomalites, and Ra and Ararat are creating by making all these sacred sites all around the world and doing this geomancy. They are slowly forming around the Earth. Every time they build a new one, it changes the shape a little bit, and they keep getting it closer and closer and closer to a grid that is an icosahedron, dodecahedron blend perfectly at a very specific angle. Also, it's similar to the other one, but it's completely different. And this one was discovered by Russia. We do know that. And they were the ones that first discovered that, and I'm sure have done massive research on how that grid relates into the next level of consciousness, because that's where we're going. Without these grids, without this new grid that is being formed right now, there would be no ascension. Nobody would be able to move from where we are now, and no one would ever be able to go into a higher level of consciousness until that grid is completed and finished. And so before that, you could move to, you could become an ascended master, but we could not move as an entire race, as an entire planet. We could not move until that's completed. The differences in these 3 consciousness, these 3 different ways of perceiving the reality, are tied to something that is called the golden mean. The golden mean is something that is in all life everywhere, though it's not directly being done. It's done through the Fibonacci. This would take a while of study to understand this. The golden mean is a proportion. If you were to cut a stick at a certain place, it would be such that this point would be 1, and this one would be 1.6180339, and it would go on forever. It's an unending number. But life is always trying to reach this number, and so is consciousness. Consciousness it's a relationship between the square and the circle. And when the perimeter of the square and the circumference of the circle are exactly the same, that's the golden mean. And but we reach it in stages. And so the aberrational grid is very close to the golden mean. It's not perfect. It's off a little bit, but it is close. The grid that we're on, this middle grid that we're on right now, it is not even close to being golden mean. It's so far off, it's ridiculous. And so we are not in tune with nature. That's obvious. This is why we're killing the planet. This is meant to be a transition state between the aberrational state and the next higher level of consciousness. We're meant to come here, spend a few moments, and get on with it, and go on to another level. Because we can't stay here, because anybody that stays in this state of consciousness very long will kill any planet that they're on, because they are not connected to nature. The next level that we're going to is more harmonic than the aberrational state. It is a much closer golden mean ratio consciousness, and if we can just make it to that place, then we can solve all of our problems. It will just happen pretty much automatically. So this second grid is based on what we call polarity consciousness. It's got different names around the world, but it simply means that we see everything as either black or white. We constantly are judging every situation. Every person we see, we judge them as good or bad. And this is the nature of polarity consciousness. It is a problem on one level because it creates ego in the mind. It thinks only of itself. It doesn't think of other people except in people we love or close to us. But people that are a distance from us, it doesn't care about them. It only cares about itself. And that's the level of consciousness that we're in now. Normally, these consciousness grids are created naturally. People live over hundreds of thousands of years, and they evolve over those periods of time. And in so doing, they slowly create, from the grid that they're in, they automatically create the next grid through a natural process. But because we arrived at this once before, we're being allowed to reach this, but to reach it synthetically. We're through creating pyramids and buildings and structures and temples all over the world. This is a synthetic way of doing this. And you need to understand that this is what is going on. It is synthetic. We're being given a second chance at all of this. It's all been synthetic, right even from the beginning. If you go back even into Egypt, they were using pyramids there, and they were using pyramids to raise it. They used frails and rods and hooks and all these other kinds of things that they used to put on the spines to tune them to the higher levels of consciousness. It was purely synthetic. And everything that has been going on for the last 13,000 years has been synthetic to get us to this place. And once we're on it, all that will not be of any use anymore, because then once we're on that and we're back onto that consciousness grid, we can go on our own without anybody's help. We'll be able to continue on from there on. I guess there's another little piece that we should explain. I talked about these three men, Chikutet, Arlich, Vomalites, Ra, and Ararat. Well, the first one, Chikutet, Arlich, Vomalites, he was the king of Atlantis for a very long time. According to the Emerald Tablets, which was written 2,000 years ago, he was ascended master. He had lived there for 52,000 years, believe it or not. When it came time to be for Egypt, he changed his name to Thoth, T-H-O-T-H. Thoth was in Egypt, he was the scribe. Changed his name to Thoth, T-H-O-T-H. Thoth was in Egypt, he was the scribe, the person who wrote down history. Since he lived for so long, he just kept writing it down. And so everything that I've learned from this pretty much was originally from Thoth. However, his wife was Shizat, and she was also a scribe. She was equally writing down the history. And this is something I think that people need to understand. Almost all of modern history was written by men, and the women were just, their ideas of what took place were just dropped out. But in Egypt, that never took place. Thoth wrote down his ideas of what he believed, his observations and what he saw, and his wife wrote down her observations. They did not correspond at all the times. They saw things differently. They were like a coin with a heads and a tail. And one side was male and one side was female. And really, to really know history and to understand history, you must have both the male and female point of view, or you do not get a full picture of what really took place. Now we need to add another piece to all of this so it begins to make more sense. And you can begin to see that this is just not fantasy, but this is science and mathematics. There was a man named Carl P. Munk who discovered something incredible. And this was toward the end of last century, I think, maybe even as early as the 1980s. But he discovered that when you go to any of these pyramids and churches and temples around the world, that they have a code written on the outside of the building. You don't even have to go inside. It has to do with the shape, with the number of steps, and a lot of different forms that are on the outside of these things. You can go onto his website if you wish to understand what he's talking about in detail. And this is just a review of his work, by the way. This is I'm not going to go into great detail on this. I'm only going to just give a review of it. So each one of these pyramids, when you look at them, or buildings, will, from the external view of it, will, if you know how to read this code, will produce these series of 3 numbers. And these 3 numbers tell you exactly. It's the longitude, latitude of a grid, not the one we're using today, but an ancient one. And those numbers, in order to arrive at that precision where every single one of those 83,000 sites are precisely on Earth, to arrive at that, we would normally imagine that they would have to be in space and have satellites, a GPS system like we have today. I mean, how could they do this? But what his work has shown is that this is true, that these codes that are coming out of these pyramids are real and actually do delineate. But in order to understand what the system is, you have to look at something very interesting. Ra and Aragat and Chikatet Arlich Vomalites, they knew where the new poles were going to be, and they knew what the new equator was going to be, which is the one we have now. They knew that before, at least 200 years before it actually happened. They calculated that, however they did that. But the prime meridian that we use today is not the one he uses. The one that Thoth is using is the Great Pyramid itself. If you take the North Pole and the South Pole and run a line directly over the apex of the Great Pyramid, that is the prime meridian of this system. And which makes sense. It's the first building that was built. And furthermore, that first building wasn't just placed anywhere on Earth. It happens to be the precise center of the entire landmass of the Earth. They knew that even if you couldn't find that building for some reason, that that spot is not going to move more than a few inches over 13,000 years. There's another thing about Carl's work that's pretty interesting. It was introduced into the United Nations, and the whole system of all of this was given to them, and exactly how it works, and this the new system that they had found and everything, and how this all these pyramids were all around the world were connected to it. And but they didn't know what to do. I mean, it defies everything that modern man knows about ancient man. This makes ancient man on almost the same level that we're on, and how could this possibly be? But they couldn't deny it either, because there it was. It was mathematical fact. And so it's been kind of just shoved under the floor of somewhere in the United Nations. Has been put under a carpet somewhere and just forgotten, because it didn't fit into anything that we know. And so what I'd like to do now is just to read to you directly from Carl's work some of what he has found to be true, and then you'll begin to understand this. I was trying to develop a code system to be based on the language of latitude and longitude, degrees, minutes, and seconds. The idea being to multiply the 3 numbers in each set to a single number, 15 degrees times 15 minutes times 01.6000 seconds. Products at 360, the number of degrees of an arc in any circle. For example, when I divided 360 degrees constant by 19 degrees, 18 minutes to 01.05263157892 seconds, I found myself on the parallel of latitude which crosses the Mexico's round 360 degrees Quihuiculico pyramid just south of Mexico City. But later, when probing the larger 21,600, the number of nautical miles in the Earth's polar circumference, I found that when I divided it down through 51 degrees and 10 minutes to 42.3529411 seconds, it crossed the exact center of England's Stonehenge, another round 360-degree monument, which originally had 60 stones around its perimeter, as 60 stones times 360 degrees multiplies to exactly 21,600. Problem is, these pyramid grid scenarios kept coming. Egypt's El Kula pyramid at 36, its bent pyramid of Sinafu, 180, the Druid Mound in Massachusetts, 180, the earthen ideogram fort at Newark, Ohio, 2,160, the Temple of the Atlantis at Tula in Mexico, 2,880, the Giza Sphinx at 5,400, Georgia's Kolomoliki Mound, 7,200, Ohio's Seep Mound, 8,640, Mississippi, 10,800, the Great Triangle drawn on the plains of Nazca in Peru, 17,280, and Germany's Golo Earth Circle near Bond, 27,000. The eye and the mile-long face at Poverty Point, Louisiana, 32,400. The Oregon Vortex, 48,600. Manos, another drawing on Nazca's plains, 64,800. And North Bimini's Shark Mound and the Pyramid at the Magicians at Uxmal, 129,600, all of which are divisible by 360. Now that you've heard Munch's words, you begin to understand that there is this precision grid of 83,000 sites all over the world that are precisely put on the planet, precisely in very specific places, and that it was not possible that this could have been done by all these indigenous tribes like the Mayans or the Egyptians or the Chinese, etc., but rather it had to be a single mind, a single thought, a single plan to do this. There is no other way. And this changes the whole understanding of history and who we were before and who we are now. And so now you can see what Chikitet, Arlich, Fomalites, and Ra and Ararat were doing. They were creating these structures all over the world to change the internal flow of the Earth's energies, which is called geomancy, so that the external flow was altered, and in so doing, slowly creating this electromagnetic field, that's the geometrical electromagnetic field that surrounded the Earth. And in doing that, they were recreating our consciousness grid so that we would be able to ascend. This is a gift of love. It shows that we are not alone in our consciousness and what is going on with us in this world, and that we have not been forgotten. They remember us, and they're taking care of us. These are our ancestors. These are the old ones that are still connected to us now. They extend through all cultures and all levels of life, even down in German families and American families, and from South Africa or anywhere else. These are our ancestors doing something for us so that we can make a change. And in making this change, we do something for them. We bring them back. We'll explain this later. Now, with that background, with that knowledge and that information, we're going to begin to tell you the living side of all of this, the story that has unfolded around the world over the last really probably 65 years or so. And so it took time. I mean, as Atlantis sank and all the different factors began to happen, the pyramids started to be built continuously all around the world, especially after the first 6,000 years. It took that long. In the precession of the equinoxes, there was a point in there that we had to reach before the pyramids and everything could really start to be built on a massive scale, because humanity was not on a level that they could do those kinds of things. But eventually, after 6,000 years, we were ready. And so these pyramids started to be built here and there in China and Japan and in the Yucatan and Guatemala and South America, all over the world, in Russia. And as this was going on, each time one of these was built, the electronic grid around the Earth would take a little bit more geometrical form and become a little more closer to what would be necessary for us to be able to connect to as a living thing. Progress all the way up until, say, about 65 years ago, directly after World War II. And then things began to happen on another level. We had other people began to become involved in what we were doing. Only 1 year after the World War II was over with, in 1946, the summer of 1946, spaceships appeared all over Europe and every single military base there, almost without exception. The following year, in June of 1947, spaceships appeared all over the military bases all over the United States. How do I know this? Because there's historical documents that most people haven't seen that proves that this is true. And this opened another doorway, because now we began to get extraterrestrials involved in this work of this grid, besides just the ascended masters and humanity. By a little bit later in that, by the 1960s, we began to see crop circles in England. We began to see crop circles that were not only in wheat and different kinds of crops, but we began to see ice circles where they were formed in ice, and circles that were huge, and obviously nobody had stepped on the ground at all. They were perfectly embedded in the ice, and we found thousands of these now. Then we found crop circles that were with trees in Canada, where the trees were formed over. No human being could have done this either. And though we do know through Colin Andrews that about 80% of the crop circles were man-made, the other 20% are not human, at least human as we know it, based crop circles. This was another level of communication that began to take place around the world. It was important communication, but to this day we haven't really understood what they were saying. As we got closer up into about the 1980s, a phenomenon began to take place, and there was probably many of you watching this may remember this. From about 1983, 4, all the way up, and maybe even as early as 1980 or so, all the way up to about 1991, 1992, there were people all over the world, and I mean everywhere, that were sitting in meditation. They were mostly people that did do meditation, that were able to understand subtle energies. And in their meditations, they were told that they had to take a crystal to some pyramid, some temple, somewhere in the world, and to program it in a certain kind of way and to place it there. We estimate at least 150,000 to 100 to 150,000 people were involved in this. And every time someone went to a certain temple, like Chichen Itza in Mexico, and placed a little crystal in a certain place where they were told to do, this affected the energy of the geomancy of that space just a tiny bit, which would then correct the geometries that were above the earth. After probably a number of crystals that approached nearly 1 million crystals, this had a dramatic effect on the unity grid above the earth. But by 1989, and this was documented from the people that I work with at any rate, by 1989, the unity grid around the world was geometrically proper, meaning it was an icosahedron, pentagonal dodecahedron relationship, and energy was moving through it and flowing through it for the first time, but it still was not perfect. There were still problems involved in this, and more corrections need to be made. By the mid-90s, there was a small group of people. This number of people was probably less than 100 people. It was probably closer to 70 or 80 that were experts on subtle energies. And I was one of those, but only one. There were many, many, many other people that were just as important doing what they were doing on those levels. And we were directed to go to very specific pyramids and to make very specific changes, and not changes in the grid or by changing the energies of the pyramids or the temples, but rather the indigenous people that lived in those areas had done things in their lifetime that had caused a distortion in the energetic body of the earth. We had to go into the Anasazi at one point and make corrections in the Four Corners area where we are now because of what they did over the years that they were involved. We then were involved with the Maya and in Guatemala and Belize and in that area down in there, doing ceremony after ceremony after ceremony to solve the problems of which what they did a long time ago. We then went into Peru with the Inca, and each time, by the way, we were invited to these places. We didn't just show up and say, hey, we want to do something here. Each time, the people of that area would ask us to come there, and we would always accept it, and they knew exactly what we were doing and why we were doing it. The Incas appeared while we were in Mexico and said that the shamans wanted us in Peru. When they got there, though, they didn't just accept us. We had to show by our actions and our energies signs that would come from within Mother Earth to prove that we were the people. Each time this was always the case. It didn't matter what we said, it was what Mother Earth said in our behalf. And we passed every one of these tests and began to correct all these things. We went into New Zealand, and there is a very good video that will be coming out very soon to show you how and what these kinds of things